Normally, I would have asked Deacon Jeff to preach. With ominous readings like this, hands and arms being cut off and eyes being thrown into wherever, Jesus sounds like he's upset. He's wagging his finger at his disciples. He's changing all the laws. He seems to be making them stricter. This is not the touchy-feely Jesus that you get in some of the healing stories. But take a second look. When you go home, you might reread the passage or listen to it again, especially in tandem with that first reading from Sirach. Because when you do so, it starts to take on a different feel. Because maybe this is not as straightforward as it seems at first glance, or not as literal as it might sound when we hear it out of context. I don't think that we are being presented with a list of do's and don'ts. Actually, I think we're being presented with quite the opposite. I think we are being asked to consider how we make choices, given the guidelines, scenarios, or even case studies in the gospel, if you will. If you choose to keep the commandments, they will save you. If you trust in God, you too shall live. He has set before you fire and water. To whichever you choose, stretch forth your hand. Before us are life and death, good and evil. Whichever we choose shall be given us. Emphasis on the verbs. The reading from Sirach has to do with choices. It has to do with intentionality. What are we choosing to do? How are we voting with our feet, if you will? What are the choices we make? And maybe more importantly, how do we go about making those decisions? Matthew presents Jesus as saying, "Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do so will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever obeys and teaches these commandments will be called greatest in the kingdom of heaven." It's about making choices. What are you going to do? Are you going to break the commandments and then teach others to do so? Or are you going to obey and teach the commandments? What choices are you making? How are you going about making those choices? Many of you know that in 1989, 6 Jesuits, their housekeeper and her daughter, were murdered at the University of Central America in El Salvador in the middle of the night. The 7th Jesuit in that community, who would have been murdered alongside them if he had been home, but he was out of the country, was Father John Sobrino, who was a renowned theologian. And one of John Sobrino's famously quoted lines is this: "Some people consider us," speaking about himself, liberation theologian, "some people consider us ignorant. But we're not so ignorant as not to follow Jesus' example, to socialize with and serve the poor, who society considers nobodies. Jesus' mission was to show society's nobodies that they are God's somebodies." And then he goes on to say, "We're not so ignorant that we fail to see that how we theologize, how we preach, and how we serve can introduce grace or sin into the world." Think about that for a second. How we theologize, how we preach, how we serve can introduce grace or sin into the world. Introduce grace or sin into the world. It's the same choice Jesus is asking us to make. Are you going to break the commandments and teach others to do so? Or are you going to obey and teach the commandments? It's the same choice Sirach is talking about. Before us are life and death, good and evil. Whichever we choose shall be given us. So what do we choose to do? And how are we going to make that choice? Are we going to be informed by the gospel, by the words of Jesus, by the spirit of love and mercy that pervaded his ministry? Or are we going to be slaves to the letter of the law, being legalistic like the scribes and Pharisees? Are we going to disregard all of it altogether? Choose death, choose evil, choose to be hurtful and pessimistic? Because even before we write or speak or serve, we have a choice. We have a choice between what is of God and what is not. We have a choice between what leads to God and what doesn't. We have a choice between life and death, between mercy, compassion, love, charity, generosity, kindness on the one hand, callousness, indifference, hatred, hostility, cruelty on the other hand. Are we going to choose life or are we going to choose death? I think this is what Jesus is talking about when he mentions killing and adultery and false oaths in today's gospel. I think he is talking about the choices that we make and how we make them. Are we going to choose life or are we going to choose death? Are we going to introduce grace or are we going to introduce sin into the world? So what choices are we going to make? That's the first question. The second question is, how are we going to make them? What is going to guide our decision making? The ability to choose is called discernment. It is the process of coming to a decision. We make decisions based on some criteria, usually something that fills us with joy or peace or hope. Then how is it possible that decisions sometimes turn out badly? Why do some of us make the right choice and some of us don't? Or that some of us have friends who counsel us with wisdom, while others listen to so-called friends who always seem to lead us down the wrong path. If we don't discern our motivation for acting, if we don't discern the how, I think then we are doomed to fail. For what we have done is we have introduced sin into the world. And just because we belong to a church or a prayer group or a religious order or the priesthood doesn't automatically make us an instrument of God. I think we must examine what we say and do and how we say and do it before we act. What Jesus offers us is to help us to choose life, to help us to introduce grace into the world. Because grace leads to God. Because kindness and mercy lead to God. Because love and compassion and justice lead to God. If you choose, you can keep the commandments. They will save you. If you trust in God, you too shall live. He has set before you fire and water. To whichever you choose, stretch forth your hand. Before us are life and death, good and evil. Whichever we choose shall be given us.